remains a function of a person's opinion. It seems to me that Jim's argument with the DSM-4 is reducible to, I think it is not useful, therefore it is not useful. It is my view that the world exists independently of our perception of it. To me, a proposition is true by the existence of a fact that corresponds to that proposition. The truth of a statement or the accuracy of a diagnosis is determined by how it relates to the world, or whether it accurately describes the world. My view proposes the existence of an objective ontological reality independent of the perceiving subject. Thus, I disagree with Berkeley's SAS Percepi principle and the multiple variations of constructivist thinking that, according to von Glaserfeld, claims that the function of thinking is, quote, to organize the experiential world, not the discovery of ontological reality. Therefore, if one does not believe that ontological reality exists, then the DSM-4 of necessity turns out to be not only useless, but impossible. Applying my epistemological approach to the DSM-4, I can say that client A exhibits symptoms of schizophrenia based on a given definition of schizophrenia. The subjective experience of either the client or the clinician does not alter that reality. In other words, if the voices tell the schizophrenic client that they are not indeed schizophrenic, and they believe those voices to be correct, does that mean the client does not have the disorder? Of course not. I believe we can describe diagnostic categories and refine them as scholarship moves forward. Hopefully, DSM-5 will take us to that next step. Thank you.
I think our next debate is going to be about constructivism.
Should be.
And I didn't even mention constructivism in what I had said, and none of what I say depends upon that type of epistemology. So I was kind of wondering what you were referring to, Phil, during your talk there. And what I was mentioning is the psychometric properties, which is an objective scientific fact and draws from an epistemology of realism. I mentioned the foundations of what a diagnostic manual has to have, which has nothing to do with constructivism. I mentioned the utility of the DSM, which is consistent with the pragmatism that Phil says his position is grounded in. Okay? I consider myself a strong pragmatist and would endorse the use of the DSM in a second if it was good for clinical work. Okay? But let's think about it. Is it good for clinical work? That's the bottom line for me, right? It would be good for clinical work if it supported the type of work we do. What do? We build relationships. Does it help relationships? No. Then it's probably not a good tool for us, just like the periodic table of elements is probably not a good tool for us. Okay? So a lot of what Phil's firing back at me has to do with epistemology. I don't see the core of my argument drawing from epistemology at all. In fact, it draws much more from if it's epistemological at all, it is so in the traditional sense, drawing from a strong, realist, objectivist position. I guess that's all I have to say about it.
I'm going to jump in the middle and cut the tension with a knife a little bit. At this point, we're going to open up the floor to questions from the audience. So if anybody has a question, please feel free to rise and address the question to our speakers. If anybody has a question of me or them, and while you're speaking, please speak loudly enough for everybody to hear. Who would like to start us off? Sounds good.
Steve Mercer. Dr. Hansen, assuming that the DSM isn't practical and isn't useful, what would you suggest to be used as an alternative? Or is it not important to understand the differentiation between conditions?
Okay, so the question, just so everybody can hear it, is what would be a useful alternative to the DSM-4? Did I get it correctly? Great, Dr.
There's many models in counseling that have proven utilities over the years. There are many different diagnostic systems and developmental models that could be adopted. Stages of change models, for example, family systems types of models. So there's absolutely no shortage of systems to use, or none at all. Now I say not at all because I look at counseling as primarily a conversational profession. And counseling is essentially conversational engineering, with the counselor engineering a conversation so that the other person can benefit. And I see us then in the same professional category as lawyers or loan officers or teachers in that regard. And all of them get along just fine without a diagnostic manual. I don't see why a fundamentally conversational profession requires one. However, if we were to use one, there's no shortage of models within our profession that we could adopt that have proven utility.
Would there be one that you would prefer, or one that you would recommend, or would you recommend that at all?
I like Nancy McWilliams' model, which is in psychoanalytic diagnosis. Phil had a lot to say about psychoanalytic diagnosis, some of which I would disagree with. But her model is my personal favorite. You see, if you're going to develop a relationship with someone, which is what we like to do in counseling, you want to get to know them on the inside, not only on the outside. The DSM is an outside diagnostic manual. It just tells you what's going on that you can observe. We need some way of thinking about what's going on inside. I find her model a useful way of thinking about that.
Well, Steve, I think conversational engineering as a description of counseling isn't going to work very well with a client with major depressive disorder for whom a prescription of Zoloft might be a significant necessity to their recovery. In other words, you can converse from dawn till dark with a schizophrenic, but Zyprexa will be necessary, or Risperdal, if you are to make an effective intervention in this person's difficulty. Therefore, you need to be able to understand that the client has schizophrenia in order to make that positive intervention in the person's life. Failure to understand that this client has schizophrenia and another client has bipolar disorder will necessarily cloud the issue and diminish the chance that this person is going to have a good outcome. Conversational engineering simply will not reverse depleted serotonin or dopamine or whatever other neurotransmitter system that's involved.
All right, next question from Jennifer.
Dr. O'Quire, is it possible that the DSM discriminates against an essential type of thinking? We say it's logical, but yet our mind, we have so much that is not used. Isn't it possible that we're putting boundaries on our minds and presenting, someone coming presenting schizophrenia, isn't it possible two people could come in with similar symptoms and we're labeling them, but yet one's mind could be further mature than another's and experiencing two different things, and we label it, therefore we're making people afraid to come in and discuss what's going on with them because they're afraid of being labeled, but yet they could be experiencing something beyond the boundary of what we're I feel like we're limiting our world, our society. We're not addressing it. Is that possible?
No.
Just so everyone knows, the gist of the question is, does the DSM place too many boundaries and labels on clients coming in?
Thank you, Jennifer. First of all, the question of labeling, we addressed that earlier on, and the DSM-4 addressed that point Jim missed in referring to these diagnoses as labels. So the DSM-4 admonishes all of us to not label people. In other words, to avoid exactly what you're talking about. So that's an important point. In terms of, does it have a limiting, it depends on how it is used. For instance, you can have a client who has been given a diagnosis and uses it themselves as a label, not just the clinician. Every now and then you will have a client who will be very proud of the fact that they have paranoid schizophrenia because somebody told them they had paranoid schizophrenia and now they see it as a label and a badge and so on and so forth. And that is the downside of how some people utilize the DSM-4. And we want to avoid that kind of misuse of it. In terms of its limitations, its 5 axes broadens the description of each individual. And so any person who meets axis 1 diagnosis may have axis 2, 3, 4, and 5 be very different from the next person who has the same axis 1 diagnosis. So I think used properly, it avoids some of the concerns that your question alludes to.
But if someone came in and said to you something they were experiencing, and because of the way society defines that experience is illogical or not the norm, they would be afraid to present that to you because you would write in there what access, and then it could be used against them if something were to come up and say then they had marital discord, and then that could be used against them down the line. If there were no labels, people would come in, they would actually identify what is going on,